Okay. Very interesting. I have a question. I mean, using a phone at the head for talking is actually not what most of the children are doing. They are mostly using mobile phones for going into the internet, or they may be involved in social networks, so they have a push functions that they are almost always updating. So regarding this exposure situation, what is the difference between children and adults? If you, let's say, carry the phone in your pocket and you just get exposure from the updating of applications that you have on your smartphones and things like that.
Want to take that question? Niels, want to take that?
According to the user manual, they're not supposed to have the phone in the pocket and operate.
Yes.
That is exactly correct, because if you do have it in your pocket, it exceeds the tested SAR. And in fact, if you go to your iPhone and you go to your settings, general, about, legal, and regulatory, you'll see that there's a warning there from the iPhone that says exactly that, not to keep it, at least, it's to be kept at least 10 millimeters from the body. My question is for Dr. Payne. Very impressive presentation, but you said, I thought I heard you say, and that's my question, that myelination is complete at age 1, and I have a colleague at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center who's been studying myelination in teenagers, and she says that while the gross process of myelination is complete at age 2, she thinks that myelination is ongoing and has been doing work to demonstrate it now through the teenage years into the mid-20s. And so I don't know what the consequences of that are. So for the SAR modeling, I want to ask this question. Let us assume that the exposures are identical. That is to say that the exposure to the brain to a child and an adult are identical. Is the brain, from what we know of its biological properties of, let's say, a 5-year-old, in terms of neuronal development, ACTH, myelination, other things, are there significant biological differences in the brain so that even if exposure were the same, you would expect different responses to microwave radiation?
Well, I said earlier, well, if anyone, unless you want, yeah, go ahead. But we should limit that we don't talk about the biological effects of the exposure and all that. But
actually, I was going to say the same. I'm not a biologist, so I really don't know what will happen in a brain of a child as it gets older. My information is based on published results, publication, and the literature. So from literature, what we knew was that myelination in human stops at 1 year old. What I was trying to say is that it's difficult to extrapolate animal data to human. We tried. There are some papers recently I found from 80s that give calculations of how to extrapolate rat age to that of human. But then it's based off either weaning time or nursery time, or so it's different. It's very, very complex and difficult. From even that paper, it was very difficult to get the younger rats to more than, say, few-month-old human baby. So I would say that the oldest rat we had would be equivalent to an adult, and the youngest rat, baby rat that we had would be equivalent to few-month-old baby, human baby.
So my question is for Jafar. So you took into consideration what happens when you put the hand on and hand off. Did you correct for the impedance change that would be due to having the hand, just like Dr. Wang in your model?
you mean that whether the effect of the impedance, the loading on the normalization, is that what your question? Or?
Right. Everything you put around the antenna changes its properties.
The results were normalized to 1 watt antenna input power, and the loading effect was not taken into account.
Would the real device So you normalize what's simulated, but then the real device, when you put something around it,
Yes.
it's going to actually have different fields coming out of it. So,
Yes, we know that it is affected and depending, but one thing why the results are normalized to 1 watt input power is the fact that the old amplifiers that we have, there is a power level regulator, which means that it keeps the power levels in a constant. That's the reason why we are using this normalization. There's a question over here.
Maybe I can quickly comment on the issue with the power. So what we saw in lots of simulations of cell phone models with many details, so of course they are detuned significantly when you put it against the head, when you put the hand on the cell phone, or even when you change your mesh. So getting the antenna impedance perfectly correct is difficult in the cell phone simulations. But what we observed is when normalizing to the power that we feed into the antennas, regardless of the matching, that we always get a very consistent result for the SAR, regardless of the modeling details which may affect the antenna impedance. So like this, we get a rather, or by normalizing to the antenna power, we get a rather robust result for the correlation of the power and the SAR. And considering that we have a power regulation in the cell phone, which in the worst case will maximize the power if the antenna is detuned. So what we saw here may not reflect the actual behavior of the cell phone, but is perfectly applicable to the worst case situation if the cell phone operates at its maximum power level.
Okay, there's a question there.
Hello, I have a question for Japa. You were saying that the normalized results did not support the assumption of age-dependent differences, but I think when I consider age-dependent differences, we assume that this means small compared to big heads. But does it actually support differences by size of head or shape of head?
That's something which my statements were related to the 1 gram and 10 gram SAR. Assume that I given a very different and probably more understandable example. Assume that you have a 1 watt, let's say, light source close to your head, and you have a child, she or he has the same lamp. Of course, if you divide by the size of the head and the weight, so the relative energy absorption in the child head would be higher because the bigger, the smaller head. But that's another completely different question. If we have exposure standards which are based on infant and young tissues studies and all are well taken care, then you should just care about what are the exposure limits and based on that examine the whole question.
Okay, question?
Well, in fact, I have 3 questions, but I'll start with the first one to Niels. On your second question is definitely yes, there's an increase of the SAR in the brain, but if you look at the variability due to the hands, as we have seen yesterday, and you make this really definitely statement of increase, because for children, and also I would like to relate it to the hand that you use in the simulation, a smaller hand for children, because children has much smaller hands than adults have.
Well, we can't talk, now I can. The up to 3 dB, not definitely up to 3 dB high exposure of the children brain tissues is just a function of the closer proximity. we look at the hand as a separate issue. So so the hand can either decrease or increase, and so strongly depend on the phone. And that then again basically translates one-to-one into the brain exposure.
Yeah, but we should look at it as one problem, because you cannot separate it. We're just looking here, we're not looking at compliance. It's a completely different story. We're looking at realistic exposures. As we have seen from Mark's presentation, we have so much variations. If you have realistic phones, if you have different hands, different positions, how can you really make statements in realistic exposure that it will really have an increase of 3 dB?
Yeah, these are the two different interests which need to be separated. Those are the manufacturers want to make sure that and regulators that the phones are compliant with the safety guidelines, whereas epidemiologists want to know what is the real life exposure. And I think mainly in this workshop we're addressing the compliance issue.
Oh, I think it's so different.
I agree, so that the plus 3 dB, that is not a number which could be used for epidemiology per se.
Yeah. I thought this workshop was about real life exposure differences between adults and children, not about compliance.
Okay. Jafar and Joe will respond to the question.
Yes, just for your information that the present protocol regarding the SAR compliance assessment, the no-hand case that we have at the moment, it best addresses the children exposure. That was brought into the attention of the committee by Niels Koster, just for your information that the present protocol best covers the children's exposure. The technical details, if you're interested, we can communicate with you.
Just to complement what has been said by Niels, is mainly the problem we observed for the specific tissue is the location of the phone relatively to the brain, due to the elasticity of the pinna, but mainly due also to the curvature of the head. So that means one statement is the location seems to have an influence on the brain exposure. Your question is a small hand able to induce a different impact or a different influence on the SAR? So in this case, you're right, we have to take into account the small hand and the head, the child head, and the large hand and the adult head. But in this case, I think that it's under review, because we are analyzing what should be the influence of the hand, and is there any systematic or is there any significance from a statistic point of view impact? I think at this time we have only a few hands, and maybe the key question has been first to see is the hand has an influence or not.
Okay, Laurie, something to say?
The single largest factor for variation of SAR is the volume of tissue that you look at. And as I showed in that one thing, in that one slide there, it was over 19 watts per kilogram when you go down to 1 millimeter cubed. Now that's still has at least 600,000 neurons in, and the whole idea of the exposure limits is to protect from heating.
I want to remind you the currently two international standards based on the 10 gram average. So you want to 1 milligram. Now there's no biological studies at this time to indicating the one neuron can have a specific effect. So that's all based on the weight of evidence study of the last 60 years.
But it's literally true that the smaller the volume, the higher the SAR. If you did the whole brain, obviously, since a lot of it is not exposed, that would reduce the SAR. And it basically decreases as the volume drops smaller, increases as the volume drops smaller. That may be the standard set 20 some odd years ago, but we now know a lot more, and we need to change the standard itself.
One more question there? There.
Well, let me ask you, you had some very interesting data on glasses, jewelry, etc., and I know you won't have an opportunity to go into detail, but could you characterize what kind of response is a systematic way in which metal jewelry affects the SAR? What would that be? And what design changes would you imagine could be made if one wanted to reduce exposures in the phone and the case, keeping in mind that cases nowadays, metal cases in particular, cases that boost your battery, also can boost the SAR. And of course, as you all know, phones are not tested in cases. If they were tested in cases, it might be very different, and there might be great advantages for certain case designs. So I invite you to comment on case and antenna design as they may affect the SAR, as well as jewelry, bracelets, etc.
Anyone want to comment on that? Well, at least as I know, nobody make a metal case to put there. If you whoever make that will be the wrong way of doing it, because you are like putting your phone talk with a cell phone. That's not a good smart way of putting your phone inside a metal case. Right. One question about on the jewelry effects. Yeah.
That's actually those familiar with these simulations and the whole radio engineering, they know that single and very small changes and perturbation of the whole system would affect the exposure. And so in order to analyze the case by case should be analyzed and then covered. So in general, it's very difficult for me now here to say what will affect and not. But what I know is that all those things that are close to the antenna and which affects the antenna radiation will have a direct impact on the SAR.
Yeah, in general, the effects is related to the metal size and the wavelengths. So as closer they are, as larger the effect can be expected. So in general, jewelry is, if not extreme, small to the wavelengths. If it's where that the hand at the ear can be larger, but there the increase will be locally, will not affect the compliance testing. So I think here the main focus are we sure that the children and adults are equally included in the test procedures with respect to the matrix defined by the safety guidelines, and I think that can be, as mentioned, answered as yes.
Okay, thank you, the panel. I'm sorry I have to limit the time because we have a social event and we need to go back to our hotel, coming back here for the bus. So let's have the last 5 minutes for the rapporteur, Dr. Foster, to give a conclusion of our workshop.
CK asked me to make everything clear in 5 minutes. Instead, I will go back to the city of brotherly love and think about this for a while, and then maybe write a review article on this subject. But the two questions that CK started the session with, really only one of them provoked much discussion, and that was, is SAR higher in children compared to adults? It seems to me that answering this is difficult, partly because of the larger issue that the field and the regulatory agencies have created an enormously difficult engineering problem for which there are many different ways of looking at it. Part of the issue that we discussed may have originated from a simple mistake in one of the early papers, but clearly after listening to all these discussions, it seems that this is a very complex issue. As I think Niels pointed out, there's in a near field exposure situation, the geometry should be dependent upon the antenna, and there should not be any important difference between the size or shape of the head. However, as we found out from a number of the speakers, because of the slight differences in the geometry of the head of children and adults, elasticity of the ear and so forth, there may well be some differences in SAR between children and adults. Although, as Jafar pointed out in his paper, there are so many other variables that it may not matter too much averaged over many different kinds of exposures, and that other variables are perhaps more important than the differences in size and shape between children and adults' heads. I'd just like to conclude by violating what CK pointed to a number of times, that we should not discuss the biology. As Dr. Wang pointed out, I think other speakers alluded to, the present exposure limits are designed to protect against excessive heating, and it's unquestionable that the exposure from mobile phones would cause hazards based upon heating. If some other hazard were demonstrated, then of course the entire situation would change. So, at least as far as we know now, from a practical point of view, it doesn't matter whether there are differences in SAR between children and adults, as long as the exposure is below regulatory limits. Again, if knowledge changes in the future, everything will change, and these considerations that we discussed here may be important or may not be important, depending on exactly what the issue is. Thank you.
Thank you for your participation. So I declare this workshop is closed. Thanks to all the panel members. Thank you very much.